I was never supposed to be born. At least, that's what my mother used to say. Every argument, every setback, every empty bill on the counter. Somehow, I was the reason. I learned to stay quiet, to move softly, to not need too much. But even silence couldn't make me invisible. By the time I was 16, I knew exactly what I was in that house. The problem, the reminder, the thing they couldn't fix. So I left. I built a life from scratch, one steady job at a time, one small act of kindness at a time. And years later, when they needed the one person they'd spent a lifetime blaming, I was still there, but not the way they expected. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about something stronger. What happens when the forgotten one stops asking to be forgiven? I was born on one of the hottest days of July, in a house that always seemed too small for the amount of bitterness it held. My mother used to say the heat broke her that summer, but I always wondered if it was really me. She'd tell the story sometimes, how the fan stopped working, how the doctor was late, how my father wasn't there because the truck broke down. It sounded like an ordinary tale of bad luck, but the way she told it, you could feel the resentment curl around every word. "You came into this world already causing trouble," she'd say, half laughing, half sighing, and I'd force a smile like it was a joke. But even as a child, I could hear the truth hiding under her voice. I wasn't supposed to be there. I grew up in that weathered house on the edge of town, the one with peeling white paint and a screen door that never quite shut. My brothers Tom and David were older, perfect really, at least in her eyes. They had golden hair and easy smiles, played football, brought home good grades, and could do no wrong. The walls were covered in their photographs, trophies, report cards, handprints in paint. My own pictures were smaller, tucked at the corner of a frame or taped crookedly to the fridge. When guests came over, my mother would beam and tell stories about her boys. She never mentioned me unless someone asked. And even then it was just, "Oh, that's Lydia, she helps out." I learned early that love in our house wasn't a given, it was earned. And even then, it came with strings. My mother had a way of turning kindness into guilt. If she bought me new shoes, she'd remind me that money didn't grow on trees. If she cooked something I liked, she'd sigh and say, "I suppose you'll just never be satisfied." I remember once, when I was about 9, bringing her a drawing I made of our family, all of us standing by the house. She looked at it and frowned. "You drew yourself in the middle," she said. "That's not right." Then she put it down and went back to folding laundry. I stood there staring at it for a long time, wondering where I was supposed to stand. My father, well, he wasn't cruel, not in the way she was, but he was quiet, distant, the kind of man who lived in the background of his own life. He worked long hours at the mill, came home smelling like smoke and iron, and barely spoke at the table. When he did, it was to my brothers, about work, sports, cars, things that belonged in their world, not mine. I tried once to tell him about a book I was reading, something about a nurse who saved a child in the war. He nodded once, said, "That's nice," and went back to his plate. I stopped trying after that. The thing about growing up unwanted is that it teaches you how to disappear. You learn to move quietly, to read moods like weather, to sense when a storm is coming long before the thunder. I helped my mother with dishes, fold laundry, make myself useful. Anything to avoid the cold look that meant I'd said the wrong thing again. When the yelling started, I'd hide on the porch, pressing my knees to my chest, counting the seconds between her words. Sometimes I'd watch the lights flicker from the houses down the road and imagine what it would be like to live somewhere else. Somewhere people laughed without fear of being punished for it. Every year on my birthday, my mother would bake a small cake, but it wasn't for celebration. It was tradition, like sweeping the porch. She'd hand me a piece with a tired smile, as if checking off an obligation. I never had parties, no candles to blow out. Just one small slice and a reminder that you should be grateful you even have this. When I turned 12, I remember asking if we could go out for ice cream instead. She stared at me for a long time and said, "You think money grows on trees, don't you?" I never asked again. Still, there were small pockets of light in that house, tiny things that kept me going. My grandmother, for one. She lived 2 streets over and had the softest hands I'd ever known. When I visited, she'd brush my hair and tell me stories about her garden, about patience, about how flowers bloom even in the cracks of sidewalks. "You just have to give them time," she'd say. I think she saw what my mother didn't, or maybe what my mother refused to. She once told me, "Some people are born to love less than others. Don't take it personal, darling. Just don't become one of them." I didn't understand it fully then, but I carried those words with me like a secret shield. In school, I wasn't popular or loud. I kept my head down, did my homework, smiled when spoken to. Teachers liked me because I was polite, quiet, dependable, the kind of student who never caused trouble, but I envied the kids who could laugh loudly, who went home to parents waiting in the car. I used to linger at the end of the day, pretending to organize my desk just so I wouldn't have to walk home so soon. The walk back always felt longer than it should, like the air got heavier the closer I got to that house. By the time I was 16, I understood my place. I wasn't the daughter to be loved. I was the one to blame when things went wrong. When my father lost his job for a few months, my mother snapped at me one night, "If you hadn't come along, we could have saved more. We'd be comfortable now." She said it so casually between stirring the pot and wiping the counter that it almost didn't sound like cruelty, just fact. But it stayed with me. Every word, every tone, every reminder that I was the crack in her perfect picture. The truth is, I started building walls long before I knew what they were. Emotional ones, quiet ones. I didn't yell back or argue. I just learned how to hold my silence like armor. I started saving whatever little money I could, coins from babysitting, tips from helping Mrs. Green at the bakery on weekends. I'd tuck them into an old tin box under my bed. It wasn't much, but it was something that belonged only to me. There were nights when I'd lie awake, listening to the sound of the train passing in the distance. The walls would rattle, and I'd imagine it was calling me somewhere else, anywhere but there. I promised myself that one day I'd get on a train like that and never come back. Not out of spite, not to make anyone sorry, just because I wanted to see what it felt like to breathe without guilt. My brothers grew up and left, but they always came back to visit, bringing gifts, stories, and smiles that made my mother beam. I'd watch from the kitchen, making coffee, listening to her laughter fill the house again. She never laughed like that with me. I don't think she knew how. One evening, as they sat around the table, I heard her say, "I don't know what I'd do without my boys." I was standing right behind her, holding a tray of plates. She didn't turn around. I set the plates down quietly and excused myself. Later that night, when everyone was gone and the house was still, I looked in the mirror and whispered, "You're not invisible, not forever." Looking back now, I think that's when something in me began to shift. I stopped hoping for the kind of love that wasn't coming. I started paying attention to the world outside that house, the kindness of strangers, the quiet strength of people who kept going, even when life wasn't fair. It was small things. A teacher who said I had potential, a neighbor who asked how I was doing, and actually listened. Each moment chipped away at the story my mother had built around me. When I graduated high school, no one came to the ceremony. My name was called, and I walked across the stage alone. I still remember the echo of my shoes against the gym floor, the polite applause from strangers who didn't know me. I held that diploma in my hands like it was proof. Not that I was loved, but that I existed, that I had made it this far despite everything. That night I walked home under the streetlights, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt steady, stronger somehow, like I had survived something no one even noticed I was fighting. I didn't know it then, but that quiet strength would become my greatest weapon. It wouldn't make me rich or popular or erase the hurt, but it would carry me through every trial that came next, and it would prepare me for the moment years later when my family would try to erase me completely, and I'd finally learn how to show them what they never saw before. I left on a damp morning in late October, the kind of morning that makes you tuck your collar up and hurry along, pretending you don't feel the weight of goodbyes. Mrs. Green from down the street came out with a paper bag of sandwiches and a sleepy smile. "You'll need a full stomach for the first day," she said, pressing a small handful of folded bills into my hand. "You've got that look. Don't you waste it?" I cried then quietly, under my scarf while the screen door slapped shut behind me, and I told her I would be careful. I told myself the same thing too. The train smelled of oil and old carpet and the little tin of coal dust that clung to the station platform. I watched the houses we passed blur into a watercolor of yards and porches, and with every mile I felt a quiet loosening inside me, like a knot gradually coming undone. I kept the tin box with my coins in my lap for the first hour, feeling the clink of change like a small, reassuring pulse. I had no grand plan, no dramatic promise to myself, only the modest map I'd sketched in my head. Work the nights, study in the day, save enough to keep going. It was simpler than running, simpler than waiting for someone to tell me I wasn't wanted. It was mine. The town I moved to smelled of pine and motor oil. The diner where I found my first job had neon over the door and a bell that binged every time someone came in, and the owner, a man named Sal, had a way of treating you like family on day one. "We don't have many rules," he told me, eyes crinkling. "Be here, be on time, don't cut the bacon too thin." I laughed then in a small, private way that felt almost criminal, laughing because I was allowed to laugh at something so ordinary. The nights were long, plates clinked, coffee steamed, the jukebox played the same 3 songs in a loop, and I learned to time my breath with the rhythm of the place. Customers came and went like weather. Sometimes a regular would stay and talk for hours. Other times the booth sat empty until the kitchen clock told us to close. I studied between shifts, reading nursing textbooks under the diner's fluorescent lights, my knees messy with flour and my hands smelling faintly of frying grease. There were nights when my eyes burned, and I thought I'd fall asleep with a fork in my hand, but the little things kept me steady. A customer who tipped well because I'd asked about her arthritis, and listened, really listened. A fellow student shared study notes and laughed when I mispronounced a Latin term. The math problems didn't feel like puzzle traps anymore. They were tools, ways to understand the body, and how to help it mend. Every chapter learned felt like another brick in a house I was building just for me. Loneliness found me often, but it was different out here. In my old home, loneliness had been a cold thing that spoke in my mother's voice, and in the way my father looked through me. Out here, it was softer, a companion at the counter as I washed dishes after midnight, a quiet that hummed while I read library books under a lamp. I wrote a letter home fairly often at first, tidy cursive on lined paper, telling them about the learning and the people, about how the coffee at the diner tasted better than anything I'd had before. I told my grandmother everything. She would send me a postcard that smelled faintly of flowers, and I would keep it folded inside my little tin box. The letters from my mother were different. They arrived in short bursts at odd times. The envelopes often creased as if hastily opened and resealed. At first they were practical. Reminders about bills I'd promised to help with, a note about the cat that had somehow learned to open the pantry door. But between the practical lines there were always small barbs, a remark about how I should come by more often if I could, a hint that my choices had made things difficult for everyone. "We managed," she'd write. "Don't worry your pretty head." There was that tone again. Not exactly anger, but a thin, dismissive thing that lasted longer than any kind of warmth. I started to learn how to fold away the sting. I replied when I wanted to and let some letters sit unopened when the ache felt too sharp. Mrs. Green's kindness was a quiet anchor. She'd send me a pie once she heard I had worked late, and I'd eat it under my kitchen light, thinking of her hands and the way she'd said, "Don't waste it." Sometimes, generosity shows up like a hand on your shoulder, and nothing more is expected in return. That, too, taught me something. The work at the diner introduced me to all kinds of people. There was a retired firefighter who always left a single dollar extra and said, "For your future," like it was a small prophecy. There was a young couple who came in on Friday nights and would plan their vacations loud enough for the whole room to hear. There was a nurse, older than me, who left a flyer for a night class and said, "You've got the hands for it." I pinned that flyer to my jacket by instinct, and the next month found myself in a small classroom, nervous but determined, holding a stethoscope for the first time, like it was a fragile bird. Nursing school was nothing like the movies. It was late nights, early mornings, the smell of antiseptic, and the quiet dignity of people at their weakest and most honest. I learned how to move a patient with care, so it wouldn't feel like a chore, how to hold a trembling hand when the words wouldn't come, how to write neat notes that made sense to someone who would read them at 3 a.m. between coffee and exhaustion. There's a kind of humility that comes with nursing work. You learn quickly that your presence can mean more than your words. I liked that. It fit with the person I'd been shaping. Steady, useful, quietly present. Sometimes, when I was on my break, I'd walk to the little park next to the school and sit on a bench that watched the lake. The water would be quiet, just the soft ripple of wind, and I'd close my eyes and think of the house I'd left behind. There were memories that still pierced, like the time my mother had scolded me for bringing home a stray cat. "You know we can't keep things like that," she'd said, and turned away. I'd sit with that memory like a stone in my shoe, until it settled into something less sharp. Years passed, and the small comforts of my new life accumulated. I paid my rent on time, kept my books, and graduated. I remember the day I pinned my nursing badge onto my scrubs and walked through the hospital doors feeling like I'd stepped into the air after being underground. I had patients who trusted me with their quietest moments, a man who wanted his favorite hymn sung as he closed his eyes, a mother who squeezed my hand so hard I thought it would break when her child was wheeled into surgery. Those trusts were more valuable than any applause my brothers ever received. They were my proof that I mattered in a way that was real and independent of anyone else's approval. Letters from home grew fewer. Once in a while a postcard arrived with a scribbled note about something small. Other times the silence stretched. I learned to live with it. People say absence makes the heart grow fonder. In my case, absence made me steadier. I understood that the threads tying me to my old life were frayed, and rather than mourn them, I knotted new ties. Friends who brought casseroles when I worked double shifts, a neighbor who shared his lemon tree's bounty, colleagues who covered shifts without question. My life felt more like a quilt than a single frayed rope. Then when my mother fell ill, they called. The voice on the other end of the line was my youngest brother's, clipped and careful. "Ma's not doing well," he said. "You should come." For a moment, old reflexes sparked. The lane in my chest that had always led toward home hummed awake. I booked a ticket with hands that trembled for reasons I couldn't name. I wanted to go because there is a small, stubborn part of love that refuses to obey rules. I wanted to know if perhaps things had softened, if time had worn down the angles of bitterness. I arrived to a house that smelled like past medicines and faded rugs. My father moved slowly around the kitchen, thinner than the last time I'd seen him, his hands uncertain with tasks that used to be second nature. My brothers hovered at the edge of things, their faces professionally concerned. My mother lay in bed with a sheet pulled up to her chin, eyes smaller and more sunken. She saw me when I entered, and for a second something flickered across her face. Maybe surprise, maybe calculation. And then she blinked and said, "Oh, you're here." It was not a welcome, it was an observation. I did what I could. I washed the dishes, brought her tea, sat by the window, and read aloud from a book she used to like when she could keep her attention. She listened in fragments, nodding sometimes, or knitting her fingers together, as if remembering a rhythm. The house moved around us like a clock running on old batteries, the same grooves and habits, but with new fragility showing at the edges. The last letter I received from her arrived a week after I'd been back in town, when she was already quieter. It was short, the handwriting a little shakier than before. "You never did what you should," it said. "You left when we needed you. I know how it is." There was no ink of apology, no admission of regret, only the same old assessment that somehow my presence had always been a liability. I folded the paper and placed it in my pocket. I felt a small familiar pull in my chest, the one that used to tighten into anger. But this time, the feeling that rose was different. It wasn't the need to explain or to persuade. It was a soft, steady acceptance. I sat with that letter for a while, turning the edges with my thumb, thinking of Mrs. Green's hand on my shoulder years ago, and the firefighter who left me $1 for my future. I thought of the patients who had trusted me with their last breaths, of the small house I'd managed to keep tidy, of the life I'd built that was mine to care for and to cherish. The need to be forgiven by those who refused to change faded like a lamp dimming in another room. I understood then that some people will always need someone to blame. That is their way of dealing with what feels uncontrollable. I did not have to be that person. The final goodbye at the small funeral was quiet, the kind of thing that lodges in your bones and leaves no dramatic finality. I wore the dress I'd bought for my graduation, the one that made me feel like a woman who belonged to her life. My brothers read something polite at the service. I listened, then walked out to the parking lot when it was my turn to go. There were no contradictions, no sudden reconciliations, just the regular, ordinary movement of people carrying on. On the ride back to the city, I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the tin box under my bed. I closed the lid and felt something within me uncoil, like a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding. Leaving had not been a wound to hide from. It had been a door. I had walked through it and found a life that had rooms warmed by my own hands. I had not left to punish anyone. I left to learn how to be kind to myself. The acceptance I felt that day did not come with fireworks or sudden relief. It was quieter, a settling like the last page of a long book turning. I had no illusions about what would change at home. People rarely change without choosing to. But I had chosen myself, and that made all the difference. I returned to my life at the diner, to my classes and shifts, with a small, steady joy that felt like a private warmth. There were still lonely nights, of course, and moments when old memories reached up like shadows. But I wore them like a shawl, part of me, yes, but not the whole of me. and in that soft, deliberate space between what had been and what I was building, I began to see the shape of something new, a life stitched together, from small, faithful acts. It would carry me further than any apology ever could. The little house I bought sat on the edge of town like a promise kept. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a porch that caught the afternoon sun, and a garden that liked to surprise me with a new flower when I wasn't looking. But it was mine in the way that mattered most. I remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were steady, the ink moving like something certain. For the first time in many years, I felt the word home fit around me without effort. It was quiet in the way that holds room for thinking, not the loud, restless quiet I'd grown up with. It was the kind of peace a person can build when they learn how to be gentle with themselves. Work gave me purpose the way bread gives a household. Nursing taught me how to notice what people don't say. I learned to hold a hand without offering platitudes, to scrub and dress wounds while letting space for a patient's story. People in town started to know me. Mrs. Klein from the post office would ask for my advice about her father's medication. The teacher down the street would trust me, with a sprained ankle after recess, and parents would sigh with relief when I promised I'd be there for their child's IV. It wasn't fame, it was trust, the quiet kind that reaches you in the middle of the night when someone needs help. Those little trusts stacked up into something steady. I wasn't invisible to everyone, not anymore. On weekends I'd work a double shift at the clinic, and then come home to put the kettle on, sat down with a sandwich and a book. I painted one wall in the living room a pale blue because the realtor had said neutral was best for resale. But I wanted a color that made me breathe a little easier. I planted lavender along the porch railing because my grandmother had loved that smell, and sometimes when the wind passed through, I could see her hands in my mind, shaping the soil. The house became a witness to a new life. Bills paid, small dinners on worn plates, a calendar with the word vacation, penciled in one summer and actually kept. Despite the quiet joy, I didn't cut ties entirely. I believed, in the way my grandmother taught me to believe, that doing right didn't mean being a fool, so I kept sending what I could to help with my parents' bills. It was never a large sum, never enough to cover luxuries, but it kept the lights on and the phone line working in a house that had once been proud. I never announced it. I would slip an envelope into the mail with an ordinary hand, same as anyone paying a bill. There was a small satisfaction in knowing the checks arrived, in hearing the mail slot click, and imagining the moment they were read. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I could, and because kindness felt like a skill I had finally learned to use. My brothers called on occasion, mostly when something needed fixing. Lyd Tom would say, "The furnace is acting up," or David would ask if I could cover a bill while he waited on a paycheck. I did what I could. I'm not proud of that. Not that I helped, but I was tired of playing the angry child in their stories. So I sent money without drama. They visited sometimes when they needed to collect something from the house, the old tools, a box of keepsakes, and they left quickly afterward. Their presence in my life was sporadic, like summer rain. It came in a downpour when needed, and left the ground dry soon after. Mostly the town gave me the kind of life a person could steady themselves with. I learned to like the sound of my own footsteps on the front porch in the morning. I learned to go to bed without worrying that someone would find a new reason to blame me in the night. There were community potlucks where I'd bring a casserole, and they'd bring stories. There were Sunday afternoons when I would read in the chair by the window, the light warm on my knees. It was small, but it was mine, and the safety of it felt like a slow, careful repair. Then one afternoon, sitting at the clinic's front desk, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Tom's name. I felt a small quickening. Not joy, not exactly, but the reflexive pull of blood. "Lydia," he said, voice practiced, measured. "Ma's not doing well." There was a pause that felt like someone balancing a small, sharp object. "You should come," he added, and the line hummed with something unsaid. When I arrived home, the house smelled different, a scent of medicine and folded linen. My father moved slower now, his shoulders down like someone carrying a long burden. My brothers hovered with a kind of careful competence, as if grief were something to be scheduled and managed. I sat in a chair near my mother's bed and watched her breathe. Her features had softened into something that belonged to years of small repairs and tired smiles. There's a certain thinness that comes with illness, a shrinking that makes a person smaller, and in some curious way, more human. She noticed me, the way a person notices weather, an acknowledgement without ceremony. "Oh," she said, and I watched for the crack, for whatever small admission might come with the sight of her daughter returned. There was none. She held my gaze for a minute as if measuring how inconvenient I'd become. "You came," she said, as if she had expected anything else. The words were not warm, they were facts, like a note left on the table. I did what I could during the days I stayed. I brewed tea, arranged pillows, read aloud when her voice drifted. I sat with the silence that had always lived in the corners of our home. For a long time I thought that presence mattered in and of itself, that simply being there might soften something inside her. But people do not always change because you stand in their doorway. Sometimes they only notice the things that reinforce their own chosen stories. A week later, when the funeral arrangements were being made, Tom called me into the kitchen. He had the thinness of someone used to giving orders. "We've decided it would be better if you didn't come to the service," he said. His words were careful, measured like a harmless tool. "It would make things uncomfortable." The sentence landed like a small, sharp stone. For a moment I felt something like the old knot in my chest return. The same tightness that had taught me how to be small in the house with the sagging porch. I sat there a long time after he left, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. The house hummed around me with its ordinary sounds, the refrigerator clicking, the muffled sound of a neighbor mowing a lawn. I thought of the money I had sent to keep their lights on, of the afternoons I had spent bringing soup, of the years I had folded my life into quiet kindness. I thought of the times I had stood behind my mother setting plates on the table, while she laughed with my brothers. The sting wasn't so much the exclusion as the way it sealed everything else into a neat, predictable pattern. They'd always had roles for me: helper, scapegoat, background. Nothing had changed. Something shifted then, but not in the way Tom expected. I did not rise up in anger or slam the phone down. I felt something clearer than hurt, a kind of quiet clarity that cut like sunlight through fog. I saw with a steady, calm edge what had been true for a long time: the people who refuse to change will not be changed by footfalls at their door. I had been trying to live in the expectation of their approval for decades, and it had only shrunk me. The letter Tom's voice carried was just another small example. If I stayed trying to fit into a place that had no room for me, I would shrink until I was no longer myself. I folded the thought around me like a sweater. It wasn't bitterness I felt so much as an opening, a place where energy could move toward something better. The decision did not announce itself with fireworks. It arrived quietly as the seasons do, a recognition that some things are not yours to mend. I would not come to the funeral because my presence would be arranged into someone else's narrative, another prop in the play of how they wanted to be seen. Instead, I would keep the life I had built, the small house with its lavender and the patients whose hands I held, and let the people who needed me in a way that matched my worth find me. There was also a practical part of me that simply understood the truth of accounts and tasks. I had helped when help was needed, and that was enough. I would not let exclusion be a reason to stop acting kindly, but I would no longer define myself by the expectations of those who had never honored my existence. The clarity that settled in me felt like a map with a single clear instruction. Keep living. Keep being kind to the people who recognize you. Plant a garden where the sun falls. That, I realized, was a kind of strength more durable than vengeance. In the days that followed, the town did what small towns do. It noticed, and then moved on. Tom and David handled the funeral, the neighbors nodded in the grocery store, and life continued on predictable tracks. I attended to my shifts and my small garden, answering the phone when a patient needed advice, bending over charts with a calm focus. I wrote a check for the last of what I'd intended to send toward the household bills, and tucked it in the mailbox like one more small act of quiet decency. It felt right to do what I could, and then keep the rest of my energy for building what I would call my own. There are moments in life that feel like doorways. Standing on the other side of that kitchen, with the winter light narrow and clear through the window, I felt a new room opening. It was a room that let me keep my dignity and my peace without apology. It would not be the loud victory some might want. There was no dramatic closure, no public reckoning. But there was a steadiness in my chest I hadn't owned before, like finally finding the right name for a sound you've heard all your life. I turned back to my life then, the one that had been patiently waiting. The patients who trusted me. The neighbors who brought over casseroles without asking, the lavender that wanted tending. My brothers would go on in their patterns. I would go on in mine. Neither of us would be entirely wrong. We were simply differently chosen. And in that difference, I found the first clear space for a life that would not be shaped by the opinions of those who had never learned to love me fully. The envelope felt ordinary in my hands, cream a little thicker than the usual bills, stamped with the lawyer's seal. I remember sitting at my little kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting across the blue-painted wood, and thinking, for a silly second, that it might be some small, nice surprise. A check, a note of thanks, something that would fold into the ordinary rhythm of my day. Instead, the paper inside read like a final curtain. It was a letter from the family attorney. He kept his language careful and neutral, the way people do when they want to be sure every I is dotted and every T crossed. He explained the will plainly. The house, the savings, the few small investments my parents had, everything, to be transferred to Tom and David. I read the paragraph twice because the words felt oddly formal for a message that should have been tender. At the very bottom, in handwriting that was unmistakably my mother's, there was one more line. No flourish, no pretense, just, you were never one of us. I folded the paper back along the crease and sat with it a long while. The kettle hummed on the stove, and the lavender on the porch leaned in the breeze. The world continued its small, gentle motions. I didn't cry. The line from my mother was brutal in its economy. I'd been carrying that idea quietly for years like a small stone in my pocket. The surprise had long since passed. What surprised me instead was how calm I felt. There was no dramatic climax to the story I'd walked away from as a girl. Instead, there was a kind of quiet closure, not the vindictive kind, but the kind that comes when you finally stop arguing with a fact and simply accept it. I made myself a cup of tea and wandered through the rooms of the house I'd bought, touching the edge of the bookshelf Henry had once built, smoothing the throw on the chair by the window. I had planted those lavender bushes, I'd painted that pale blue wall, I'd hung the little wooden sign in the kitchen that read in faded letters, "Welcome." None of those things were flashy. They were ordinary, steady things that a person could count on when the night was long. I thought of my grandmother's hand in the soil and my own hands, making the beds, washing the dishes, changing the sheets of a patient in the middle of the night. Each small, consistent gesture was a testament. They were my legacy. I thought, too, of the checks I'd slipped into the mail over the years, the quiet contributions I made when the bills got tight. I had never done it to buy favor. I did it because even a small kindness keeps a light on for someone who might not have another. I would never pretend those envelopes bought me anything. They didn't. But they were part of a life I had chosen to lead, not one I had been handed by default. There was a part of me that felt free in the way a window feels after it's been opened for the first time in a long while. The weight of expectation loosened a little. I couldn't change the past, or the way my mother had seen me. I could, however, sit with the reality that what I had built here, in quiet measures, was real. It was not less because it was simple. It was whole because it was mine. Still, even with that steadying thought, something else nudged at the edge of my memory. My father had said, once, years ago in a way that now felt oddly prophetic, that there was a parcel of land that had been promised to someone in the family. He mentioned it offhand while fixing the porch step, as if it were a trivial house matter. Your grandmother wanted to make sure someone had a place to go, he'd said, setting the hammer down. I'd nodded then without really listening. It sounded like another family story I didn't belong in, but the lawyer's letter had loosened that memory like a seam. I found myself thinking of my grandmother more than I had in months, remembering how she pressed my hair back and told me, "Some gifts are quiet, Lyd. You have to look where others don't." I called the attorney back the next morning. His voice was steady and careful on the line. "Yes," he said after a short pause. "There is a small parcel that was transferred years ago." He explained that, before my grandmother died, she arranged for a small piece of property to be placed in a trust with my name on it. It hadn't been of interest to Tom or David. Small plots of family land rarely excite brothers who are busy with more visible things. It had sat quietly held until now. The lawyer's voice carried the facts like pebbles. The lot was a few acres on the far side of the lake, overgrown in places, bordered by a line of old maples. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was, the attorney reminded me, undeniable. It was mine. I drove out there the following week. The road that led past the mill and the feed store narrowed to a lane that made my chest relax without my permission. The maples arched over the path in a kind of cathedral hush. When the trees parted, the land opened like a held breath, exhaling. Grassy. A little wild. With the lake a soft blue in the near distance. The promise my grandmother had kept for me lived in that quiet, unassuming way that made my heart ache all at once. There was a worn path where deer had walked and the broken stump of an old fence post leaning like a sentinel. It was not pretty in the way a magazine makes things pretty. It was honest, and it belonged to no one but itself. I walked its edge slowly, feeling the earth under my shoes and thinking of my grandmother's hands. I imagined simply a bench by the water where someone could come and breathe. I thought of the women I'd cared for who had never had a quiet place to go, who sat in hospital rooms and watched the world move on. The land seemed to offer a small, unornamented promise, a place to rest, a place to remember, a place to begin. For the first time since the letter, I felt a warmth that wasn't defensive or brittle. It was the warmth of a seed finding good soil. On the drive back, I thought about how people sometimes think of inheritance only as money or property, with a dollar sign. But my inheritance felt different. It was a piece of ground my grandmother had chosen to set aside, a small stubborn gift in a family that often mistook affection for obligation. She had seen something in me the others did not, or could not, and had quietly put that belief into action. That was a kind of faith that didn't require a public declaration. It required only trust, and when I considered it, I felt a tenderness toward her I hadn't allowed myself before. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table and spread the letter out again, this time with a different attention. I made notes, practical things, the lawyer's phone number, the county office to call, the measurements the deed listed. I wrote down a plan, not a grand scheme, but a small blueprint. I thought about clearing the path, planting something that would draw bees, maybe building that bench by the water. I thought about a sign that read haven or rest, a word that felt gentle and honest. My hands moved as if someone had finally given me permission to design not just a life for myself, but a place where other quiet lives might find a little ease. There was also a part of me that laughed softly at the irony. My brothers had the house and the money they had fought for, the visible trophies of family approval. They could walk into that inherited house and stand where they always had, nodding at the pictures on the wall and telling the stories that made them look good. I had something they had never seen, a choice, a place that would not measure my worth in attendance or applause. It was something their hands could not take, because my grandmother had thought to place it beyond the reach of such small dramas. She'd given me more than land. She'd given me a chance to define what legacy meant for me. The thought settled like dust, finding its place in a sunlit room. I did not feel the spark of hatred or triumph I might have expected. Instead, there was a steady, quiet pleasure in knowing that someone once had seen me as more than a fault line in their story. It was enough to shape what came next. I folded the papers carefully and placed them in the tin box under my bed, right beside the postcards from my grandmother. The house hummed around me in that comfortable way it had learned. Outside, the lavender swayed as if in agreement. That night, I slept with a peaceful sort of excitement. Not the feverish kind that burns you up and leaves regrets, but the kind that makes you wake early and go to the window, because you are curious to see what you will do next. The letter and the land had given me a new possibility to consider, a way to turn something meant for profit or show into a quiet act of giving. I dreamed of benches and paths and small gatherings where people could come to feel held. As morning light came through the curtains, I made a list of small things to do: call the county, speak with the lawyer, visit the site again with measuring tape. And somewhere between the practical items and the quiet imagining, I felt a new kind of direction. The inheritance, with its blunt cruelty from my mother and its quiet generosity from my grandmother, had given me a lesson. Sometimes belonging is not a thing you wait to be given. It's a place you decide to make. The map was simple, and my hands were ready. The first time I walked the full length of that little parcel by the lake, I let myself move slowly, as if the land deserved a careful greeting. The maples made a cool arch over the path, and wildflowers tossed their heads in the late breeze like a small private applause. There was something about the quiet that felt like being wrapped in an old shawl, familiar, safe, and large enough to hold whatever came next. I stood there for a long time, hands in my pockets, and thought of my grandmother's soft voice saying, "For the one who would need a place to rest." She had worried then, I supposed, about the kind of tired that runs deeper than the body. She'd known people like me who needed a stretch of earth to breathe on, and she'd put that belief into action when others were watching something flashier. The land needed work, the kind of honest, stubborn work that doesn't make headlines, only soil turnover and weeds yield. I began with small, steady tasks. I cleared a path to the water using a borrowed spade and my own 2 hands, moving at a pace that felt sensible to my bones. I found old fence posts and decided they would become markers, and I planted lavender where my grandmother's hands would have wanted it. I mended what was broken and left what seemed right to be wild. A bench appeared where the grass met the lake, something simple, made from reclaimed wood a neighbor gave me. I sanded the edges until my palms were raw, and when I finally set it by the water, I sat there a long time, letting the wind sketch its small maps across the surface. Taking the land in hand didn't come from grand designs. I didn't draw up plans that would fit in a beggar's folder. I took it step by step as I had taken my life, one reasonable decision after another. I set aside a modest portion of my savings at first. Not much, really, but enough to buy a wheelbarrow, a few saplings, and some basic supplies. There were times when money felt tight. I balanced bills and the occasional unexpected expense at the clinic. But I found that a thrift practice kindly will sustain you for the things your heart asks for. I would get up early on Saturdays, drive out with a thermos of coffee, and work until the light started to dip. Often someone from town would drive by and slow down, windows rolled halfway, and ask if I needed a hand. More than once a strong set of arms would appear to lift a log or to plant a row of wildflowers. It was as if the community recognized the quietness of the project and wanted to be part of it. The idea of a retreat for women who'd been estranged from their families came to me slowly, like a tide finding the shoreline. I thought first of myself and the way the land had soothed something raw in me. Then I thought of patients who had told parts of their stories in the hush between heartbeats. A woman who'd never been able to visit her mother because of old arguments, a daughter who'd been shamed for making different choices. I thought of the ways we tend wounds in a career, steady, unflashy, with more listening than speaking. It seemed reasonable and right to offer that same calm to others, so I began to sketch out what a small retreat might look like. A handful of simple cabins, nothing ornate, only comfortable beds and warm quilts, a communal kitchen where people could make tea and tell the stories they needed to tell, and a circle of benches where we could sit and name what we felt without apology. "Isn't it a bit lofty for you, Lydia?" my neighbor Joan asked the first time I explained the idea over a cup of coffee. She had been one of the first to offer tools and a hot lunch when I came out to clear the path. "You're talking about fixing people's hearts." I smiled then and said, "I'm not fixing anything. I'm giving a place." It was important to me that the idea remained simple. A place to rest, to sleep, to remember, not a clinic for miracles. I reached out quietly at first through colleagues I trusted, a pastor who knew how to knit together a volunteer network, and a few friends from nursing school who believed in small, sensible acts of care. There were donations of lumber and old quilts, and someone donated beds. A retired landscape architect from 2 towns offered to help design a small, accessible garden that would welcome hands of any age. People came forward not because they expected fame, but because the idea fit a part of them that already knew what it was to be needed. We decided on the name quickly, in a moment of consensus on the porch of my little house. Haven's Rest. The name felt like a soft promise rather than a proclamation. It laid claim to humility. We painted a small wooden sign in pale blue and hammered it to the post at the entrance. The first group to come were women I'd known only professionally. A single mother whose teenage son had set his back against the world, a retired teacher whose family had drifted away, a woman who had come back from years in another state to find the quiet of small-town life too loud. They arrived with small suitcases and their own private hurts. We fed them soup, walked the path to the lake, and listened without urgency. There were tears and laughter in uneven measures, and there were days when nothing happened except the slow turning of sun on leaves. It was, in its simplicity, exactly what it needed to be. Word spread the way good things in a small town do, quietly and with a kind of reliable momentum. A nurse who'd heard about the place at a conference mentioned it to a friend. Someone read a note in the church bulletin. We never advertised in a flashy way. We printed a small leaflet and left it at the clinic, at the library, and in the waiting room of the dentist who'd once lent me his pickup to haul in saplings. People came because they needed it, and because a friend recommended it, and because the place felt like a steady hand rather than a headline. The local newspaper caught wind of it sooner than I expected. One afternoon a reporter drove out, not with an eye for scandal or for grandeur, but with a sensible notebook and a patient curiosity. She took her time, walked the paths, sat on the bench by the lake, and asked the women who'd stayed to tell their stories if they wished. The piece she wrote called Haven's Rest, a sanctuary built from pain, a phrase that startled me the first time I read it. The picture that accompanied the column showed the bench I'd sanded, the lavender nodding in the foreground, and a quiet slice of the lake. I expected nothing. Instead, there was a small, gentle interest. Calls came from people wanting to volunteer, and donations trickled in. A retired carpenter offered to build a porch on one of the cabins. A local seamstress sewed curtains. People brought jars of jam and loaves of bread. The simplest generosity, given without fuss, made the place thrive. My brothers read that article at home, I learned later, as they poured their morning coffee. I imagine they read it with a quick curiosity, the sort you take in between bills and errands. I imagine the surprise arriving like a distant knock. They called me only after someone from their circle had clipped the piece and passed it along. I remember the morning the phone rang, and David's voice sounded small on the line. "So this is true," he said. "You actually did it." There was a pause where miles of old things might have been said. "Lyd," he added finally, "the article said it was for women who, you know." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I listened, and I felt neither triumph nor malice, only a steady sort of distance. He was surprised because he had been busy living in a life that measured success differently. I did not make him wrong for that. Our measures had always been different. There were small, awkward conversations after that. Tom stopped by one afternoon because he heard I was hosting a small community dinner, and he lingered longer than I expected. He tried to ask about donations and management, as if the whole thing needed accounting minds to make it valid. I answered simply and directly, like I did with patience. "We keep it modest, Tom. People volunteer. We keep the lights on and the beds warm." He looked at the lake for a long time, and when he left I saw his shoulders slump in a way that felt older than his years. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even apology. It was, I think, a recognition that something he'd overlooked had been quietly made true without him. Mostly, though, the work of Hayden's Rest continued in its unflashy rhythm. I would wake at dawn to check the garden, prep breakfast for whoever was staying, write a quick note to the volunteer roster, and then leave for my shift at the clinic, feeling like two people in one body: the nurse who tended wounds and the woman who had built a small acre of solace. In the evenings, those who stayed told stories by the kitchen table, and sometimes asked me, softly, how I'd come to do this. I told them about a grandmother who planted more than flowers, about a life of quiet choices, about the way a slow accumulation of small kindnesses could add up to something that mattered. They nodded, sometimes in tears, sometimes with a laugh that felt like a small repair. As the seasons turned, little miracles accrued. A woman reunited with her estranged sister after a weekend where they'd both learned to name things aloud, a young mother who realized she could set boundaries and keep her dignity, a retired man who wept openly for the first time in years, and then came back to help build a path. The place did not fix everything. People left with stitches still tender, but they left steadier, with a small tool to carry forward. For me, seeing that was a reward more honest and more sustaining than any applause. And so the land my grandmother had quietly put aside became exactly what she might have hoped, a space where people could come to rest, to remember, and to gather courage for whatever came next. The irony was not lost on me that a parcel set down in secret had grown into something that could not be hidden. But I liked the quietness of it. I liked how the work felt like truth being lived out in timber and lavender, in evening conversations and a bench by the water. The newspapers would bring attention for a moment. Phones would ring, old voices would test the edges, but at twilight the place settled again into its purpose. People arriving, leaves whispering, and the lake holding the sky as if that had always been its job. It came on a Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky can't quite decide whether to rain or shine. I was sitting on the porch at Haven's Rest, folding linens that smelled faintly of lavender, when the postman drove up the gravel path. He waved, the way he always did, and handed me a small stack of envelopes tied neatly with a rubber band. Most were ordinary things: donation notes, a thank you card from a former guest, a supply invoice. But one stood out, cream-colored, with my name written in handwriting that I recognized instantly, even after all these years. It was Ellen's, my brother David's wife. I turned it over once, twice. The seal was simple, nothing fancy, but something about it felt heavy. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the small wooden table beside my rocking chair and kept folding the linens. I've learned that sometimes the heart needs a moment to prepare itself, even for kindness, especially for kindness. When I finally opened the envelope, the letter inside was short, maybe half a page. The paper smelled faintly of perfume, the kind my mother used to wear. I read the words slowly, tracing each line with my eyes, as if they might disappear if I read too fast. "You did something good, Lydia. I'm sorry for how we treated you." That was it. No explanations, no stories to soften what had been done. Just those 2 sentences written in a hand that trembled slightly. For a long moment I sat still, letting them settle in. My eyes blurred a little, not from tears exactly, but from the weight of it. The way forgiveness sometimes comes wrapped in something clumsy and incomplete. It wasn't an apology that undid decades. It didn't need to be. It was acknowledgement, small and fragile but real. And for someone who had lived half a life unseen, that small flicker of recognition was enough. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing it along the crease, and placed it inside my grandmother's old Bible, the one she'd given me when I was 12. Between its pages were pressed flowers, old photographs, and a few scraps of handwritten notes she'd left. It felt right somehow to leave it there, among things that had survived storms of their own. Outside, the light had shifted. The sun hung low over the lake, stretching across the water like gold spilled from a jar. The surface rippled gently, and the scent of fresh-cut grass carried on the wind. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the sound of wind brushing through the trees. It was the same sound that had followed me since childhood, once a lonely echo, now a kind of lullaby. "They told me I ruined their lives by being born," I whispered. The words didn't sting anymore. They came out soft, almost like I was saying them for the last time, setting them down for good. I smiled, small but real. But I built one worth living, without their permission. The truth of that filled the air around me. Gentle, steady, and sure. For most of my life I'd tried to make sense of why I wasn't enough for them. Why no matter what I did or how good I tried to be, the love never came back the way I gave it. But as I watched the sun slide lower, I realized that maybe it was never about being enough. Maybe it was about learning that I already was, long before anyone ever saw it. The porch boards creaked under my feet as I stood up and walked to the railing. From where I stood, I could see the cabins of Haven's Rest, the small path leading down to the water, and the garden blooming wild and bright in the fading light. A few of the guests were out there, sitting together near the fire pit, their voices a soft hum beneath the sound of crickets. I could see the way they leaned toward each other when they spoke, the way laughter and tears seemed to live side by side. It struck me then. This was what healing looked like. Not erasing pain, not pretending the past hadn't happened, but building something whole in spite of it. My grandmother's land had become more than a retreat. It had become a mirror, showing people that the parts of themselves they thought were ruined could still bloom again. I watched as one of the women, a teacher who'd come to stay after her family cut her off, reached down and picked a handful of flowers. She held them against her chest and smiled. That small, simple gesture made something tighten gently in my throat. All of it, the years of silence, the letters that never came, the things that were taken from me, they had led to this. A life that was finally mine, lived on my own terms, surrounded by peace that didn't need anyone else's approval to exist. Sometimes I think about what Mother might say if she could see it all now. I don't imagine apologies. That was never her way. But maybe, just maybe, she would see that the daughter she once blamed had grown into someone who refused to pass that pain forward. Maybe she'd see that I had taken everything she thought was a weakness, gentleness, patience, forgiveness, and built a home out of it. The sky turned a deeper gold, and the wind carried the scent of the lake, clean and familiar. I closed my eyes for a moment, just listening. In the distance, a dove cooed from the trees, slow and steady, like the world itself was exhaling. I thought about the young woman I'd been at 18, suitcase in hand, walking away from a house that never felt like home. I thought about all the nights I'd spent wondering if I'd ever belong anywhere. And now, standing on this land, my land, I realized I had belonged all along, just not where they told me. The evening settled softly, like a blanket over the shoulders. The guests began to head inside, one by one, until the yard was still again. I stayed out a while longer, watching the last of the light fade into the horizon. There was no grand revelation, no thunder of closure, just the steady, gentle knowing that I had finally come full circle. The letter in the Bible would stay there, not as proof, but as reminder. Not that they were sorry, but that I no longer needed them to be. Life had a way of balancing things, not with revenge or spectacle, but with quiet truth. And in that truth, I'd found something better than victory. I'd found peace. As night fell, I turned off the porch light and sat one last time before heading inside. The wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of the wildflowers that grew by the path. I looked out at them, their petals shifting and glowing in the dusk, and I felt the smallest, most beautiful thing: freedom. Not the loud kind people post about, not the kind you shout from rooftops or use to prove a point. The quiet kind that lives in your bones, the kinds that comes from knowing you've stopped running, stopped pleasing, stopped waiting for permission. "I'm okay," I whispered, almost without meaning to. And I was. The camera would fade, maybe to the reflection of the sunset on the water, a deep, rippling gold. A soft piano note would linger, slow and tender, as the scene pulled back to show Haven's Rest glowing in the last light of day. And if someone asked me how it all ended, I'd say this: it didn't end with revenge or with payback. It ended with a woman who learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is live well, quietly, steadily, beautifully, even when no one ever thought you could. They told me I ruined their lives by being born, but I built one worth living. And this time, I didn't need anyone's permission to do it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Every story here reminds us that even in pain there's power, and sometimes peace is the sweetest kind of justice.